In 1754, the European powers go to war. Why do they go to war? Well, according to French intellectual and Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, who has, by the way, something to say about everything, it was for a few acres of snow in Canada. Hopefully, you guys know better, because the culprit is not so much snow and more this guy. George Washington, right? Who, because of a skirmish with French forces in what is modern day Pennsylvania, it leads to a worldwide global conflict. And remember that with the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, which is super confusing because it actually occurs over 9 years, apparently we can't math, remember that this conflict is different from virtually every other conflict we've talked about so far. These other conflicts were really indecisive, and they don't really change very much. The French and Indian War only changes everything. And you might remember, I think during the fourth lesson in this class, I mentioned that I would try to prove that Britain was late to the game of colonization, but because of its very unique sort of history involving colonization, it would eventually surpass all the other colonial powers. You know, this thesis of the rise of British North America, which, remember, the fact that Britain would eventually dominate North America, that's certainly not something that you could take for granted in the 1600s. I mean, if you were to go back in time and go to John Smith in the 16 teens in Jamestown and say, oh, BT dubs, Johnny, Britain will one day dominate virtually all of at least the northern half of the North American continent, you know, the continental United States and most of Canada, he would laugh at you. I mean, the British can't even run a small town, really, in Virginia, much less this global empire. But really, that's what the 7 Years' War eventually establishes. It establishes Britain as a worldwide global empire, and that's a status that they really don't lose until the 1940s and 50s. And even then, that's kind of arguable. But we mentioned that, during the war itself, the British colonies are sort of chaotically run and organized. You have, different colonial legislatures that are all sort of trying to organize their own war effort. That gets really chaotic, and so there's a plan to streamline everything with the Albany Plan of Union. And remember that the ultimate problem is that the individual colonial governments feel kind of queasy and uneasy about the idea of vesting that much power and control in the hands of some kind of broader colonial government. It's also maybe helpful to point out that remember that the last time you had a large sort of supra-organization that ran multiple colonies, it was the hated Dominion of New England, which also shut down many colonial legislatures, including the Massachusetts General Court for a time. So now let's actually get into the war itself, because we set up the war and talked about a lot of its causes, but now let's actually fight it. So let's go ahead and kind of spoil the story a little bit. Who wins the war? Well, obviously, Great Britain. But the more important question is why, actually. Believe it or not, the British, if you're looking at just, military organization and effectiveness, the British have a much smaller army, a much, much smaller population. The French actually have a larger economy, and, the one advantage that we kind of associate with the British historically is their enormous navy. And, of course, the British do have a very large navy, and obviously in a war that for the British mostly takes place in the colonies, having a large navy is important to transport troops and supplies, and just as importantly to cut off enemy supplies, notably from France, from arriving in Canada. But that being said, Britain has tons of military and political disadvantages and very few real advantages, except one. and it ultimately will be the advantage that allows them to win the war. And that is the British have a very sizable credit card. So if you are the British Empire during the Seven Years' War, you don't need an atom bomb or a Death Star. Your secret weapon actually really isn't a weapon at all. Instead, your weapon, the thing that allows the British to win the war against a nation that is superior to it in almost every conceivable measurement, is a credit card. Now, okay, I'm being a little anachronistic here because obviously the idea of buying something with a little plastic card hasn't caught on yet. But that's because plastic hasn't been invented yet. The idea of buying on credit, basically getting a loan in spending money that you don't have, that is a time-honored ancient tradition in world history at this point. And the British are far better at raising money on credit than their French counterparts. And it has, again, very little to do with, let's say, traditional national advantages we think of in wartime. Usually when you're looking at wars and looking at, your likelihood for success, you tend to look at the population of a country, its economic strength, is industrial capacity. And again, in the French and Indian War, the French basically, outclassed the British. The French outclassed everybody. Just to give you guys an idea, by the way, even during the beginning of the 19th century, as Britain was industrializing, the population of France was triple that of Great Britain. Okay, so in other words, Britain was, in several weight classes under France in most respects. Again, the one advantage that the British have is the ability to raise money on credit. And the reason for that is they have a national bank and a democratic system of government. Democratic. I've sort of waggled my finger at some of you who have been a little too free at using the term democratic and democracy in the 18th century, and here I am being a hypocrite. What I guess is probably a better thing to say is they have a representative government, okay? And you have to kind of take those two things together. So the thing is that the French, again, have a larger economy. France, in general, is a wealthier society. And for those of you who have never heard of Versailles, just look at a few images of Versailles on Google Earth. I feel like you really need Google Earth to kind of get the full grandeur and splendor of it. France was loaded during the 18th century, but the problem with the French system of government and the French way of raising money is that, one, if people lent the French government money, there was really no guarantee that they would get it back. And by the way, this is kind of a recurring feature in European history. So to sort of kick it back to the 1600s, the Fuggers, who were a banking family in Germany, they would loan, just enormous sums of money for, the Habsburg monarchs to basically, among other things, colonize the New World, to fight religious wars. And when it came time to pay the bills, very often the Habsburgs just kind of tore up the loan agreement and just wouldn't pay it back. They, in other words, defaulted on their loans. But of course, if you're the king, you can do that because if you're a private individual and you don't pay your bills, you don't pay your loan, well, you get evicted from your house. Does any banker want to raise an army and evict King Louis XIV from Versailles? That's right. I didn't think so. So sometimes monarchs had a habit of just, not paying their bills. And in the short term, maybe that works out for them, but in the long term, it puts them in a difficult position because if you are a banker, if you just have a lot of money and you want to invest that money in a place that's safe and get a little interest, which is what the perspective that most people have who are investing money. The question is, do you want to loan money to Charles V or Louis XIV or these other monarchs that can just kind of forget their original loan agreement? Not really. And partially is because if they default on their loan, if they decide not to pay you back, you have no recourse. It is game over for you. Well, you should have thought more carefully about lending money to God's representative on earth, the king, the emperor, whoever that is. Now, on the other hand, though, in Britain, you do have a monarch, but the monarch at this point is, I don't want to say regulated by Parliament, but at least by this point, by the 18th century, Parliament dictates how much money the crown gets to spend. And the thing is that Parliament, it's not a democratic institution. It really won't be democratic until the 19th century, because at this point, really only very wealthy elite people can vote. But if you are a banker or investor, you can probably vote. And this means that if the government decides not to pay its bills, well, next election cycle, you can fire the government and vote for somebody else. So that the representative character of government makes it easier for the British to raise money. But the other thing is that the British have a national bank. In other words, they have some kind of specialized national organization that is supposed to help, one, regulate the economy to a certain extent, but also it is responsible for floating public bonds. In other words, it basically sells bonds at a certain interest rate and people can buy them. That's kind of the way you loan money to the government, right? You agree that the government will pay you some amount of interest in the future. And the wonderful thing about government loans is that whether you're talking about the Bank of England during the 18th century or you're talking about the Treasury Department in the United States today, the fact is that whenever you loan people money, in the back of your mind, the worry is, well, what if they skedaddle? What if they run away? What if they experience bankruptcy? What if I can't get paid back? The nice thing about loaning money to the government is that, in general, at least for the British or the United States, it's a fair bet that these governments are going to be around tomorrow. And so that generates excellent credit worthiness. So people can reliably loan, at least in the case of the United States and Great Britain, money and feel pretty confident that they're going to get paid back. So those that double that combination of having a representative government at some level and having a national bank is very powerful. Now, despite all that, what happens is that people in Great Britain and the United States were also very terrified about what happens during the 7 Years' War. Basically, the British spend their way to military victory. But they spend their way to military victory in a way that frightens a lot of people. So in Britain and the United States, it's one of the powers of the legislature is the power to raise money and spend money. Well, if you have a national bank that can basically raise money without having to tax the people, how democratic is that? Now, you're probably thinking, Mr. Dry, democracy ain't a thing yet. And it's not. I mean, it was around in the time of ancient Athens, obviously, and most educated people looked at democracy in Athens and decided thanks, but no thanks. They were a little nervous about it. Even the founders, interestingly. But what will happen is that during the 19th century, democracy and democratic values, they become a thing. They become almost moral values just as much as political values. And so the idea that a government can raise money without much in the way of democratic oversight was very scary to people. Also, um, for people who are used to being in debt all the time. People who used to be indentured servants, etc. The idea of supporting a government that is willingly going into debt was positively ludicrous. And so one of the interesting things is that, if you're looking at the emergence of political parties in the United States, um, a lot of it revolves around people's interpretation as to what happens during the 7 Years' War. To people like Alexander Hamilton, who we'll talk much more about later, what Britain does here is amazing. Hamilton's like, Britain is a strong country because it has a strong financial system, and we want some of that too. And so there's this idea that national defense and a strong financial system are interlinked. But if you're looking at Thomas Jefferson, or more significantly, Andrew Jackson, the idea that a bank can do this without any real government oversight is terrifying. I mean, you elect your politician. Do you elect your local bank manager? Not really. So, in other words, if you are committed to the idea of democracy, or at least democratic values, what the British do here is very frightening. And what's just as frightening, of course, is the extent to which the national debt increases. Like, debt before the 7 Years' War was pretty high in Great Britain. Um, but it was only about a paltry 80% of gross national product. You can kind of see that right around 1763, the debt to national net income ratio increases significantly. You don't really have to know what that is. This is just kind of an indirect measurement of just how much the national debt increases. I'm sure there won't be any consequences there. Now, we should also kind of talk about how the war actually is fought at, kind of the ground level. So what happens is that at least early on in the war, before the British start raising this enormous amount of cash, the British are kind of caught flat-footed, which is really weird because if you think about it, even though the French sort of outclass the British in military advantages, that is just kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view. If you look in the colonies, the French are actually outnumbered by the American colonists. And so theoretically, at the very beginning of the war, the American colonists should be able to take the initiative and quickly take Canada. But that's not exactly how it works. And it's not exactly how it works because the British want to fight in the American colonies the way they fight in Europe generally. And we saw how during the Pequot War or King Philip's War, how that can sometimes, result in disaster. If you have, Europeans trying to fight as Europeans in the American colonies. And so what happens is that early in the war, in 1755, a British commander by the name of General Braddock decides to Leroy Jenkins his way into Canada. Basically, he tries to invade Canada pretty early on and knock it out of the war. And of course, what happens is along the way, I think in what is now modern day New York, his army gets ambushed. Of course, the British are exceptional at fighting shoulder to shoulder in big line formations. And for various reasons, I know that kind of seems silly, having troops in bright red uniforms fight side by side. But there is kind of a logic to it in Europe, where you generally have a lot of open plains. And the thing is that when you have tens of thousands of troops on a European battlefield, it can sometimes be very difficult to tell, whose soldiers are whose. Which, of course, if you're trying to aim cannons, is an important question to answer and get right. So it's very different in the colonies, though, where most of the land isn't cultivated. It's basically natural woodland, especially if we're talking about the Ohio River Valley, and the British just get massacred. Um, and Interestingly, one of the officers who's responsible for preventing it from, becoming an even worse rout or defeat was George Washington. George Washington is sent with Braddock's expedition as a militia officer, and basically, when Braddock himself is killed, Washington takes command of the remaining forces and organizes a decent retreat, which sounds a little weird, right? It's kind of like saying, well, that football player got tackled really well. Yeah, he got tackled, but he looked really graceful while being tackled. And by the way, it should also be noted that this experience with retreat would serve Washington well during the American Revolution. Dude was going to have to do it a lot. So some of these early defeats, including the destruction of Braddock's army and a few other defeats as well, resulted in the British government collapsing. That sounds really melodramatic, by the way. Basically, in the United States, we elect presidents for 4-year terms, and unless they're Richard Nixon, they're probably not going to go anywhere during those 4 years, at least on their own volition. The British political system is a little bit more chaotic. If a leader screws up, they're not just twiddling their thumbs for the remainder of their term. They get removed from office. And what happens is that after some of these early defeats, you see the ascension of William Pitt to the role of prime minister. By the way, basically, prime minister is, okay, this is my comparative government teacher heart is breaking right now. But for our purposes, just think of the prime minister as being the equivalent of being an American president. By this point, being prime minister, it means that you're the most powerful political figure in Britain, arguably more powerful than the king in most cases. And by the way, William Pitt, I could go on about his reputation and his legacy, but if you want to get a sense of how important William Pitt is, not just to the British, but to the American colonies, drive around North Carolina. In fact, drive around most states on the eastern seaboard. Have you guys ever heard of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Pittsboro, North Carolina, Pitt County, Chatham County? Basically, the name William Pitt hides in plain sight. And there is a very good reason for that. Before the French and Indian War, the American colonies had always been a sideshow. In other words, you would go and try to capture French or Spanish territory, not because you really wanted to keep it, but because you could use it as collateral when it came time to negotiate peace. So, if you take Louisburg, the stronghold of Satan, you're not really interested in keeping it if you're the British. Oh, no, what you'll do is you'll trade Louisburg back to the French in return for trade concessions, which to the merchant classes in London was what was more important. And, forget all the colonial provincials who disagree with that. For William Pitt, though, this wasn't going to be a war where the American colonies become a sideshow. No, this was a war in which the American colonies, British occupation of North America, was a prize. That was the penultimate goal. And what happens is that because Pitt is very well connected with banking families and banking organizations in Great Britain. And specifically in London, he's able to raise vast sums of money for the war effort. And so he raises large armies and navies and replaces incompetent generals with competent ones, and generals who also want to achieve results. And so what happens is that by the late 1750s, the British are ready to really start pushing the French back. Remember that if you go back to New France. Even though France is really large, most of its territory is concentrated along the St. Lawrence River, specifically the two cities of Quebec and Montreal. The British want to take those two cities. If you take those two cities, you basically take New France. That's where most of the French population is located. That's where the French war effort in the American colonies is managed, and so that becomes the goal. The problem is that Quebec is very well fortified. It's basically, again, it's on the St. Lawrence River. It occupies, kind of this elevated position where French troops can kind of fire down on the British. It's basically like, if you guys have ever seen bits and pieces of Saving Private Ryan, where American GIs storm the beaches and have to climb up these kind of rocky elevations. It's kind of like that. And so this would be hard to capture during any period of military history, but it's especially difficult during this time period where you don't have machine guns, you don't have grenades, you have a musket that has a 50-50 chance of hitting a target so long as it's not more than like 25 to 50 yards away from you. And by the way, you can only fire that thing maybe 2 or 3 times a minute. So that's kind of the situation we're talking about. Now, what happens is that in 1759, General James Wolfe leads an expedition to Quebec. And Quebec is besieged for a time. Now, Wolfe happens to spot a pass that would allow British troops to basically move behind the city of Quebec where it's unfortified. So what happens is that the British stealthily move thousands of troops across the St. Lawrence River and up to basically an elevation above the city of Quebec called the Plains of Abraham. Then one morning in 1759, the French commander-in-chief in North America, the Marquis Louis de Montcalm, looks out. I mean, it's probably a beautiful sunrise, and, he's drinking his cup of coffee or tea or his beverage of choice and, kind of taking a deep breath and stretching. It's a good day to be alive, and why is there a red mass moving towards me? And then he realizes that that red mass is actually thousands of British troops. And so Montcalm, probably browns his pristine white breeches or pants, and orders his army to assemble on the plains of Quebec to try to forestall the British advance. Now, we've mentioned that the British try to fight in this very clumsy European style, which works pretty well in Europe. It works less well in North America. But here is kind of where that way of fighting pays off, because what happens in Quebec is almost a European battle. The British basically array themselves in a big line, and the French charge forward to meet them. What the British are very good at doing is they are very good at standing in a line and firing their muskets as quickly as possible. You don't need to aim. To be honest, if you take time to aim, you're doing it wrong, because the goal isn't to actually aim at a target. The goal is for everybody to fire at once and scare the heck out of anybody they're shooting at. And so when the French advance, the British apparently load their muskets with 2 musket balls, which sounds really redneck, by the way. And as the French advance, the order is given to fire. And the French advance guard disappears in a cloud of smoke. And then, if things weren't bad enough for the French, already new Scottish Highland regiments that had been attached to the British Army charged forward, screaming Gaelic curses and war cries, and of course twirling their war swords, the Scottish claymores, not like the big double-handed swords, disappointingly, but still really big swords. And they're charging out of the smoke. And the French are already kind of a little, I don't know, they're already a bundle of nerves because they've been shot, or a lot of them have been shot. And then with this charge, this general advance of the British line, the French morale breaks. And in the course of just a few minutes, actually, French power in North America is broken forever. And you can get a sense of how significant this moment is in a painting by Benjamin West called The Death of Wolfe. Because, what happens in the Battle of Quebec, or the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, is both James Wolfe and General Montcalm are killed in action. I think in Wolfe's case, he's actually shot like 2 or 3 times. And, bizarrely enough, each time Wolfe is shot, he's like, no, I got this. I'm good. I'm cool. And he's obviously not. And so this is where I really wish we could kind of be together to analyze this painting, because believe it or not, as lame as it sounds, art reviews, artistic criticism is always fun. Portrait analysis is always fun. But for those of you who have kind of seen this pose before, you might associate it with this. This is Michelangelo's La Pieta, which basically shows Mary holding the dead body of Jesus after he's been removed from the cross. So, I'm not saying that Wolfe is British colonial Jesus, but he's certainly seen as kind of like a savior or deliverer kind of figure. And what's, of course, interesting is that Benjamin West, who's the artist, is a painter who basically does most of his work in Europe, but he's an American. And so this also, to the extent that any painter represents the opinions of the colonial population, you kind of get a sense of how significant this is for Americans. Because remember, the colonial opinion was that the French were cutting the colonial population off from their destiny on the frontier. And the victory at Quebec broke the back of French power in North America forever. We'll talk about how there were fears of Napoleon trying to reboot a French presence in North America, but France never really recovers from this. Also, we have to kind of, if we look ahead to maybe another conflict that involves the American colonies and the British, we have to kind of talk about the different military lessons that were learned from this conflict. So, from the American perspective, they look at things like Braddock's Massacre, in which thousands of British troops are ambushed by a small force of French soldiers and a larger force of Native American allies. And to the colonials, this is exactly, this is exactly what happened during the Pequot War and King Philip's War, right? Where if you fight in this very clumsy European way, you're going to get massacred. So for American colonials, it doesn't take a lot of foreshadowing to predict something like Braddock's Massacre. And so, the preeminent colonial force during this time period was a unit called Rogers Rangers. On your forms, I saw that some of you have dreams and aspirations to join the American 75th Ranger Regiment. So the American Army Rangers actually trace their descent from this group of basically frontier fighters. The American Rangers were trained basically to fight as Native Americans, and actually many Native Americans were also Rangers themselves. So the idea is that you adopt Native American tactics. You don't try to meet out in the open field. You certainly don't rush them with your bayonet. You use natural cover. You use kind of like almost like a 18th century camouflage. At the very least, you don't dress in such a way that you stand out. You don't do the equivalent of wearing neon lighting on your clothing. And so that's kind of the lesson that the Americans take. Now, for the British, you can fight like that, but that doesn't win wars. This wins wars. And what won this war? Or what won this battle? Well, guys like this. This is a depiction of an 18th century British grenadier. Disappointingly, by this point, they don't really throw hand grenades, but the idea is that these were guys who were supposed to be big, strong, and resistant to pretty much any and all injury. And if you shoot these guys, they're probably going to keep going. Yeah, they can shoot okay, but what they're really good at is rushing you and sticking you with this pointy thing on the end of their muskets called a bayonet. And for the British, that's ultimately what wins wars. These guys who basically want to do the American sniper ninja warrior thing, they don't win wars. They're good at harassing enemies, but when push comes to shove, they're not going to stand and fight to defend cities and towns from incursion. No, you need these guys, the grenadiers, who will stand and fight. And the British sort of also learn another lesson, and that is that militia forces, the dominant military force in the colonies, they're totally unreliable. And they're unreliable because they're fussy, they don't like leaving their home states and territories, and if there's any serious fighting that has to be done, they're going to run, because militia are not professional soldiers. They're people who have joined to defend their home territory, but they're probably not going to join up to go on the offensive. And so for the British, it's better just to leave war to the professionals. So let's look at the results. So in 1763, there is a treaty signed in Paris. It's going to be the first of many. This is one of those points where I have to say dates are kind of important because there are multiple treaties of Paris. But here is what happens. I'm going to kind of take this a little bit out of order. Actually, no, I'll go ahead and go in order. So the first is, of course, the extent of British debt. Give me just 1 second here. So debt has consequences. And, this is a point that the British learned in the French and Indian War. And it's also a point that remains kind of, let's say, so debt has consequences. And for the British, remember, they basically double the size of their national debt during the French and Indian War. By the eve of the American Revolution, over half of the British budget was spent just paying interest on debt. And for those of you who don't mortgage or finance or whatever, that's fine. But remember that whenever you get a loan, you have to pay off principal, which is basically what somebody loaned you in the first place. But you also have to pay interest, which is basically the amount that you're being charged for getting that money from somebody else. So in other words, the British are spending 1 out of every $2 or pounds that they raise just on the interest. You're not paying down principal. You're just paying off interest, which is a really horrible position to be in, actually. Basically, the British kind of experience what a lot of people who get a credit card very early on discover, and that is when you max out your credit card, you can kind of get caught in this spiral of debt. And there are only a few ways that you can really get out of it, unfortunately. And we'll cover those a little bit more extensively later. But on the other side, even though it was incredibly costly, the British managed to acquire territory greater in size than the Roman Empire at its height. And believe it or not, this map here, the before and after shot, doesn't really do it justice, because not only are the British consolidating territory in Canada, they're also expanding in India. And so really the British spend their way to creating a global empire. And in fact, a global empire that really dwarfs the wealth and grandeur of the French and the Spanish. I should also point out that the French think that they dodged a bullet here. The French are really worried that the British are going to try to annex some of the like a Caribbean sugar island. I forget the exact name, but so apparently the British decide not to do that, because that would actually increase the amount of sugar to such an extent that it would lower the price that the British could charge for that sugar. So they just decide to only console themselves with practically all of Canada. But if you look at the gross domestic product of Canada today and its population, the British probably made the better call here. So the other consequence here, though, is that, the French-speaking population is still around, kind of, but still, you don't have a French menace. Satan has permanently lost its stronghold in Louisbourg, right? And remember that the French are, they're kind of like this big colonial boogeyman, especially to the New English, because they're Catholic and they're a hostile military power. And of course, Great Britain and France don't really get on anyway. And so now they're gone. So if the things that bring the colonies together includes, if it includes colonial wars, well, what is that going to mean when there's no more French menace? Who are the British really protecting people from? With no more enemies on the front, no French in the, let's say, without strong French armies in the north, there's nobody really to be afraid of. And yes, there are still France's Native American allies, more on them in just a second, but from the colonial perspective, when the British fight the Native Americans, it's kind of cringy. See, ergo, Braddock's Massacre. The colonials know how to fight Native Americans better than the British do, so why do you need British protection from this point onwards? And for the British, I think they kind of have some difficulty explaining that point. Now, speaking of France's Native American allies, so obviously, for the French, they capitulate in 1763, but, nothing gained, nothing lost, really, for King Louis XV. Yes, it's an inconvenience losing Canada. Ho-hum, woe is me. But the fact is that the French could afford to lose Canada. But for France's predominantly Algonquin allies, there's a very different perspective. That's not just some throwaway province you're talking about. That's your home. And if there's any theme, if there's any pattern between the wars involving the American colonies in Great Britain, whether you're talking about the French and Indian War or the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812, the one consistency is that you can debate who wins or who loses, except there's on one point, and that is that the Native Americans are consistent losers in all of these conflicts. The Native Americans consistently lose whatever force that is protecting them. So for France's Algonquin allies, they no longer have a French protector. And so in 1763, a group of warriors from the Shawnee and Ottawa tribes are led to basically launch a rebellion led by a charismatic military leader named Pontiac. Now, we have to remember that by this point, the British are exhausted. or more specifically, their pocketbooks are exhausted. They've already accrued an enormous amount of debt, and what they want to do is they want to bring the troops home and dismantle their armies and fleets to save money. Now, though, you have another war in which you have to keep large numbers of British troops in the colonies. And so eventually, what happens is that Pontiac's rebellion is put down, but not without considerable cost and expense. And of course, the battles in Pontiac's War are not pretty affairs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, actually. So, for the consequences of Pontiac's rebellion, there are a few things that we need to remember. The first is that the king, the crown, issues a royal proclamation that establishes a line that colonial settlers are not supposed to pass. And the idea here is that this is to prevent Native Americans from rising up in rebellion again. And to be honest, it shows some degree of conscientiousness on the part of the British government, because they realize that expansion into the West has caused repeated Native American uprisings since the days of Bacon's Rebellion. And at least from the perspective of the British government, this is not intended to keep all this territory, now at least officially controlled by the British government, out of the hands of colonials. Eventually, the idea is that this boundary will be removed, and gradually movement out to the west, out west can occur. But again, from the perspective of the colonial population, this seemed like a betrayal. Remember that if we go back, what made the French so imposing is the fact that the French surrounded the British colonies and prevented expansion into the West. And remember, that was how the war began, because of the disputes between the colony of Virginia and the French over territory, right? And what the British are kind of doing is they get all that territory, and the colonials are kind of like, oh boy, it's Christmas. Like, we're going to get a ton of land, and then Christmas gets canceled. Christmas is apparently not just canceled, it's put on put on indefinite suspension, because there's no indication as to when this land will become available. So there's that problem. The other problem, of course, is that, how do you actually police this? For those of you who are kind of following modern day politics, we're not really sure how to police an even smaller border between the U.S. and Mexico. Even with modern day technology, just the cost of doing that is just mind-boggling. So the thing is that the proclamation line, preventing settlers from moving west, would require an enormous amount of soldiers, police, resources the British just don't have. And even if they did, you can't really build a wall, human or otherwise, from Maine all the way down to Georgia. So the reality is that this is unenforceable. So it just really builds resentment. It builds resentment and suspicion. But, of course, the British are trying to simply, prevent another long, drawn-out, costly war like Pontiac's Rebellion. And speaking of Pontiac's Rebellion, you have some very grisly consequences. The first is something that we should kind of be familiar with at this point. You have the emergence of groups, especially on the western frontier of certain colonies, that enact vigilante justice against Native Americans. There's a group of mostly Scots-Irish immigrants who, remember, they're kind of like the first cowboys. They're the guys who are out on the frontier. And let's say that they're fighting Native Americans, whether war has been declared or not. But the Paxton Boys were frontiersmen who basically attack a tribe of peaceful Native Americans from the Susquehannock tribe and kill some 20 of them in what's called the Conestoga Massacre. Then what they decide to do is they decide to march on the capital of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and deliver a list of grievances. So we have almost, yet again, another conflict between governments on the East Coast and aggrieved Western frontiersmen who feel that the government is out of touch with their interests. And actually, this is a great Benjamin Franklin moment because, this almost looks like a mob that's coming in to perhaps overthrow the colonial government. And Benjamin Franklin basically convinces them to disperse. And Franklin promises that he would personally bring their grievances to the Pennsylvania legislature. But again, it's one of those moments that showcase this divide between Easterners and Westerners. And this is not just something that we see in Pennsylvania, it's something that we see in many colonies. But it's also one of those, another terrible story in which for European Americans, Native Americans are increasingly seen as the enemy across the board. And usually the Native Americans who suffer the most from that perspective are not Native Americans like Pontiac or Metacom or any of these other sort of Native American war leaders. No, the people who usually suffer the most are actually peaceful Native Americans that are trying to assimilate into colonial and or American society. We saw this with the massacre of the Prayingtown Indians by the Puritans. We saw this with the fact that many of Bacon's followers would actually attack peaceful Native Americans in Virginia. So, again, we see another repetition of that. Now, something that is new is how the British put down Pontiac's rebellion. And this is actually kind of, let's say, one of those chilling anecdotes that kind of connects the world of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment with the modern world. So, context, remember that millions of Native Americans died during the Columbian Exchange, more because of, let's say, the lack of an idea of germ theory than because of systematic murder and genocide on the part of the Europeans. I mean, that does occur in many cases, but remember that, death by smallpox, that was... You don't want to just reduce it to an accident, but I mean, there's no real conception at that point of how disease is transferred, of how immunology works. But by the 18th century, because of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, there's at least an idea of how disease transmission works. And so what happens is that British Field Marshal Lord Geoffrey Amherst actually sends some of Pontiac's tribal allies blankets that had been used by smallpox victims. And this is actually one of the first examples of biological warfare in world history at this point. Other thing that kind of happens, though, is, of course, the British put down the rebellion through conventional means as well. But it kind of shows a chilling example of, let's say, British policy towards Native Americans during this time period. Finally, the end, if we have to throw in the other really significant result here, in addition to all the debt, British expansion, Pontiac's rebellion, you have the end of salutary neglect, where, remember, the colonies were kind of seen as a afterthought, and they were also seen as simply a way or a thing to extract and exploit. What happens, though, interestingly, is, during the time period where the American colonies are more independent than ever before, because the French are gone, they've kind of proven that they can fight and die for the mother country. Right as that's going on, the British kind of clamp down. and let's say regulate and oversee the colonies more directly. This kind of happens a lot with human relationships too. Actually, a lot of times what happens is you have parents who are really chillaxed when you're really young, but right around the time of adolescence, whenever you're starting to get more independent, it's at that point that they start coming around and telling you what to do. And I mean, I'm not that there are some good reasons for that. There are some bad reasons for that, but that happens a lot in both human relationships and in the relationships between different governments in different countries. So we'll talk more about the end of salutary neglect next time.